To illustrate the process of early Sunni hadith criticism, I'm going to use the example of this famous hadith about the founding of Baghdad. Now, to be clear, this will not give us much insight into the first layer of early Sunni hadith criticism. The first phase, the first sort of step of the process or of the analysis would be the establishing of some tradents as being reliable and some tradents being unreliable. And that stage of the analysis is one for which we have very little evidence. It's very hard to find anything concrete for what we might call stage one, which is establishing the base set of reliable tradents. This might be because this base set of reliable tradents was simply assumed to be reliable, so there is no real argumentation. There really wasn't any sort of process of establishing as such. They're just the great, respected, venerated teachers of the hadith critics, or the teachers of the hadith critics, or what have you. Alternatively, it may be that in order to generally establish whether or not someone is corroborated or uncorroborated, i.e. overall, in general, to do that would require collecting every single hadith that this person transmitted and then comparing every single one to every single other possible transmission of that material and seeing whether or not they're usually corroborated and so on and so forth. And so that would require just an absolutely colossal sort of assembly of material, analyzing every single transmission of a tradent in order to figure out if most of the time they're corroborated or uncorroborated. This would be a difficult task even now with our modern technology. And so it's plausible that what's actually going on in these cases is not that there's any sort of systematic study of a tradent, but rather that the hadith critics are relying upon their intuition or upon this sort of subjective feeling, their subjective impression of the reliability of the transmitter, based on their just sort of general memory or their general impression, based on their experience of just, for years sort of transmitting material and, just vaguely being aware or generally being aware of all the material that exists. All of that just sort of produces automatically for a hadith critic an assessment of the corroboratedness or the uncorroboratedness of a given tradent. And that this is the case, that it is something sort of highly subjective or even intuitive, is again actually indicated in some of the sources. Or it may be something else. Either way, this first stage of hadith criticism, the stage when you actually establish from the get-go that some tradents are reliable and others are unreliable, this phase is very hard to illustrate. We only have these extremely generic principles, and every now and again, these occasional instances where it seems to be, being discussed and applied in practice, but most of the time, we just don't know. We just don't know exactly why someone was reliable, what the specific argumentation was for the given hadith critic to actually then, as a general judgment, say this person is reliable. And many scholars have pointed this out. When it comes to the actual details, for the argumentation, why is someone thiqah, why is someone saduq, why is someone salih, why is someone da'if, mostly we don't know. We don't know. We only have these really generic principles that we can vaguely use to get a gist of maybe the kind of reasoning that was involved behind producing these judgments. Okay, so that first phase, basically it's very poorly documented, and so, I can't really sort of illustrate that. And if the very general principles that are outlined in the early literature were indeed being followed, it would actually be, you would end up writing an entire book collecting every single transmission of the tradent and then comparing them all to possible other transmissions of the same material and seeing, to what extent they're corroborated. So obviously that's not feasible. So we're going to have to leave aside this first phase, this first stage, this starting point for early Sunni hadith criticism. We're just going to take it for granted that the early hadith critics, by whatever means, however much of a question mark there is about exactly how these judgments are produced, they have a set of reliable tradents that they have identified, and there are others that they have identified as weak. And so, starting from that point, how then do the hadith critics proceed when analyzing any given hadith, any given transmission, any given set of transmissions? And that's what we're going to look at now. Alright, so the hadith that we're going to be looking at, this hadith about the founding of Baghdad, there are different versions of it, but basically what you generally find in all the different transmissions and iterations is the following set of elements. A city will be built between Dijla, Dujail, Qutrubul, and As-Sara. The treasuries and tyrants of the earth will be gathered therein, or alternatively, the tyrants of earth's people and the treasures, or treasuries, of the earth will be gathered therein. It, or its people, will be obliterated by God. It will disappear into the earth faster than an iron pin in soft earth. Now, as we can see, there are many different transmissions of this hadith. Most of them derive from, or apparently derive from, the famous late 8th century CE hadith scholar Sufyan al-Thawri, and so here we have all these different isnads emanating from him, and also he's cited here as well for another version, and here, and also here. So most versions actually, derive seemingly from Sufyan al-Thawri, and then Sufyan allegedly received this hadith, and several others also received this hadith from Asim al-Ahwal, who was a notable Basran hadith scholar, who allegedly heard it from Abu Uthman al-Nahdi, who is another Basran figure, an earlier Basran figure, and he reportedly received the hadith from Jarir ibn Abdullah, who was a companion of the Prophet. And there are some other versions as well that are attributed to Sufyan al-Thawri with alternative lines of transmission, for example from Abu Ubaidah from Anas ibn Malik. This is seemingly a Basran transmission. And then we also have, for example, Sufyan transmitting from Qais ibn Muslim, from Rib'i ibn Khirash, from Hudhayfa. And this appears to be a Kufan strand. And then we also have another transmission here from Sufyan, from Abu Ishaq al-Shibani, from Abu Qais, from Ali ibn Abi Talib. And this again appears to be a Kufan strand. So as we can see, there appears to be quite a vast network of transmission, taking this hadith back to Sufyan al-Thawri and also back to Asim. On the surface, there are many different independent transmissions of this hadith from those authorities. This hadith was universally regarded amongst the early Sunni hadith critics to be fabricated. So, for example, Yahya ibn Ma'in was a very famous early proto-Sunni hadith critic. He declared that this hadith is batil. This is a false hadith. For another example, Ali ibn Abdul Aziz, who's an early hadith scholar, he reportedly mentioned this hadith to Ahmad ibn Mani', and then Ahmad went and spoke to Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and then he came back and he said that Ahmad said, لَيْسَ لِهَذَا الْحَدِيث أَصْلٌ. This hadith has no basis. So why did they conclude this? Why did the hadith critics universally reject this hadith? Why are they all agreeing that this hadith is fabricated? Why is this hadith included in the Kitab al-Mawdu'at of Ibn al-Jawzi, the book of fabricated hadiths? For them, the reason was simple. Every single version of this hadith, every single one of these transmissions, at some point in the isnad, is transmitted by a tradent who is regarded to be weak or unreliable. Therefore, the hadith is rejected. It's not transmitted by reliable tradents. To illustrate this, I'm going to use a simplified version of the hadith diagram, and here there are no matun or anything like that. We just have pure isnads, and it's all very simplified. And every single one of the red tradents in the diagram is someone who was judged to be weak or rejected or a liar or something like that. Most of this information is preserved by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi in his Tarikh Baghdad, and also by Ibn al-Jawzi in his aforementioned Kitab al-Mawdu'at. Both of these scholars collect almost every single transmission of this hadith, and then after each one, or in relation to each one, they then cite the judgments and the criticisms either of the specific hadith or in general of a transmitter of the hadith. And in doing so, they sort of account for every single version, and they cancel out every single version. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through every single transmission here, and we're going to see how each one gets cancelled out by the hadith critics. To begin with, the hadith critics rejected Ammar ibn Sayf, and thus all of his transmissions, as unreliable. So for example, the famous hadith critic al-Bukhari said, "As for Ammar ibn Sayf al-Dabbi, it is transmitted from him, from Sufyan, from Asim, from Abu Uthman, concerning Qutrubul and Sarah. He is uncorroborated thereon. La yutaba'u alayhi. He is rejected. Munkar." Other hadith critics also had similar comments to make about Ammar, and thus all of his transmissions were cancelled out. They were rejected. And so to illustrate this, we're now just going to completely remove all of them from the diagram. There, done. He's munkar, it's over. His material is rejected. His transmission of this hadith, gone. It's out of the picture. Next we have Abdul Aziz ibn Aban, and concerning him, Yahya ibn Ma'in said, Abdul Aziz ibn Aban is a filthy liar, kadhab khabith. And then it was said to Yahya, by what means did you prove his kadhib? Did you prove his dishonesty? And Yahya said, he related from Sufyan, from Asim, from Abu Uthman, from Jarir, concerning Dijla and Dujail. So here, Abdul Aziz's unreliability is actually being demonstrated precisely because he transmitted this hadith that was rejected. And elsewhere, for example, Yahya said that Abdul Aziz was nothing or worthless, laysa bi shay', and he also said that he was a liar, kadhab. Ahmad ibn Hanbal also reportedly said about this hadith, no reliable person transmitted it. Ma haddatha bihi insan thiqa. And then when it was mentioned to Ahmad that Abdul Aziz ibn Aban also transmitted this hadith from Sufyan al-Thawri, Ahmad said, I reject him when he relates hadith about future times. And in general, Abdul Aziz was regarded to be matrukul hadith. He was regarded to be abandoned or rejected in hadith. And so all of his transmissions were then wiped out. Next we have Ismail ibn Aban, and there isn't a specific criticism of him in relation to this hadith, but in general he was declared to be matrukul hadith, he was forsaken in hadith, and therefore his transmission was rejected. Next we have Ismail ibn Amr ibn Najih, and he was declared by Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Sa'id, for example, to be weak, da'if, and far gone, dhahib. And according to Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi as well, he said of Ismail, he was a purveyor of strange and rejected hadiths, sahib al-gharaib wa manakir, from Sufyan al-Thawri and others. Therefore, his transmission was completely rejected. Next we have Abu Sufyan, Ubaidullah ibn Sufyan. He was generally regarded to be weak and to have transmitted mixed up hadiths, but according to Yahya, he was actually a liar, kadhab. Therefore, his transmission was rejected. Next we have Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Umar, and he was judged to be someone who transmitted rejected hadiths from reliable tradents. حدث بأحاديث مناكر عن الثقات. And he was also compared to Al-Waqidi in terms of his unreliability. Therefore, his transmission was also rejected. So now, as we can see, all of these transmissions from Sufyan of this version of the hadith have been eliminated. But what about the other co-transmissions from Asim? Many of these were rejected by Ahmad ibn Hanbal in swift succession. So for example, there's a report from Ahmad ibn Hanbal's son Abdullah, which is transmitted in several versions, and when you put them all together, this is what emerges. My father mentioned the hadith of al-Muharibi from Asim, from Abu Uthman, from Jarir. A city will be built between Dijla and Dujail. Then he said, al-Muharibi used to sit with Saif ibn Muhammad, the nephew of Sufyan al-Thawri. Saif was a liar, kadhab, and I think that al-Muharibi actually heard it from him. It was mentioned to him, or to my father, verily Abdul Aziz ibn Aban transmitted it from Sufyan, from Asim. Then he said, everyone who transmitted this hadith from Sufyan was a liar, kadhab. I said to him, verily Luwayn related it from Muhammad ibn Jabir. Then he said, perhaps Muhammad ibn Jabir inserted the hadith into his book. And my father said, this is a hadith that is inauthentic, laysa bi sahih. Or he said, false, kadhib. So here we see that the transmission of al-Muharibi has been eliminated, and also the transmission of Luwayn from Muhammad ibn Jabir, likewise eliminated. And these same traditions are elsewhere in general just declared to be unreliable. The same goes for the infamous Saif ibn Muhammad, who is famously rejected as a kadhab, as a liar. Abu Shihab is actually not as negatively regarded as most of these others, but al-Khatib al-Baghdadi still collects a negative assessment in regards to him in relation to this hadith. So he says, as for Abu Shihab al-Hamat, he was sincere, saduq. However, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan was not pleased with his condition as a transmitter of hadith, and he used to say he was not a good memorizer of hadith. Lam yakun bil hafiz. I believe that the hadith that he cited from Asim actually came to him from Ammar ibn Saif, or Saif ibn Muhammad, or Muhammad ibn Jabir. Then he transmitted it from Asim as a mursal, i.e. indirectly, because Al-Hasan ibn Arabi did not mention from him, i.e. Abu Shihab, any direct transmission from Asim therein. So in other words, according to Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, there is doubt about Abu Shihab, and he says, look, Al-Hasan ibn Arabi, who's the student, in what he transmits from Abu Shihab, he doesn't actually depict an explicit direct transmission occurring between Abu Shihab and Asim. And so therefore, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi thinks, actually, Abu Shihab received this hadith from one of those other already rejected figures, and he didn't actually receive this directly from Asim. And as it happens, one of these later transmitters was also regarded to be da'if as well, and so therefore this line of transmission was rejected. And that means that every single line of transmission of this hadith from Asim al-Ahwal was rejected. Every single one was transmitted by someone who was regarded to be unreliable. Therefore, all transmissions from Asim were rejected. Next we have Saleh ibn Bayan, and he was rejected by Ad-Daraqutni, for example, as matruk, forsaken. And concerning the version that he transmitted in particular, Ibn Adi stated, this hadith has been transmitted from a Thawri by another isnad. Regarding Saleh ibn Bayan, I do not know of him except in regards to the insignificant things that I just mentioned. I only mentioned these two hadiths to clarify that they are rejected. The first, cited previously by Ibn Adi, from Usama ibn Zayd, and the second from a Thawri by this isnad. So here Ibn Adi is explicitly rejecting this transmission from Saleh, who was matruk, who was forsaken. Next we have this transmission from Hamam ibn Muslim, and he was accused of being someone who would steal hadith, yasriqul hadith. So he would borrow hadiths and then falsely cite them from alternative isnads. So he was just completely rejected. And as it happens also, his student Sulaiman ibn Rabi' al-Nahdi was also regarded to be da'if and matruk. So this transmission was also rejected. And that means there are no parallel transmissions of this version of the hadith from Sufyan, from Abu Ubaidah, from Anas. Next we have Umar ibn Yahya, and he was deemed to be matrukul hadith. He was forsaken in hadith. For example, Abu Nu'aym Ibrahim al-Isfahani says this. And so therefore his transmission of this other version from Sufyan, from Qais, was rejected. Next we have Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Ghallabi, and he was rejected as worthless or as nothing, laysa bi shay', and as weak, da'if, and as unreliable, laysa bi thiqa. So his transmissions of this hadith were completely rejected as well. And finally we have this last transmission from Sufyan all the way back to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and the full isnad of this one is not recorded, but it is mentioned about it by Ibn al-Munadi that this has an extremely weak isnad. Isnad shadid al-da'af. And therefore, this version was rejected as well. Thus, every single transmission of this hadith was rejected. All versions were rejected, because every single one contains at some point in the isnads someone who was regarded to be weak or unreliable, or to be a liar or a fabricator, etc. And so it didn't matter that there were numerous seemingly independent transmissions of this hadith from various authorities back to Sufyan al-Thawri, back to Asim. It didn't make a difference. All of them were rejected. According to the hadith critics, it is more likely that all of these different transmitters borrowed this hadith from each other and falsely ascribed it back to Sufyan al-Thawri and Asim, than that Sufyan al-Thawri and Asim actually transmitted this hadith. For them, the fact that no reliable person transmitted this hadith from Sufyan and from Asim meant that it was fabricated.